Thank you very much, Eric. That was very, very nice of you. I have to say that this has been a great day, actually. So I do want to thank Eric and Joe and everybody else who had a hand in putting together this conference and the various sessions and the speakers. It's really been an amazing combination of detailed empirical work and that also spanning various disciplines and everything from conceptual stuff to very detailed considerations of the practice of industrial policy. How do you do it? The politics. So it's really been quite an instructive day for me. So again, thank you, the organizers. And this has also the advantage that at least some of the usual preaching I need to do when I'm talking about industrial policy to audiences where economists predominate, as I guess this one still is. I can sort of cut it short, and so since I'm standing between sort of you and dinner right now, so I think maybe this will be a little bit shorter. I will start with what seems to have been the obligatory slide with almost all presentations that people say either industrial policy is back or they say industrial policy never disappeared. So my version of the slide is that industrial policy actually never really disappeared. It has a very long history. That is true, of course, in the United States, and it really goes back to all the way to the founding of the Republic. Of course, Alexander Hamilton's advocacy of tariffs on manufacturing was really one of the most articulate statements of infant industry protection for countries that are falling behind. His policies were not adopted at the time. It took a civil war for the United States really to put up tariffs. But there has been quite a history of experimentation with different kinds of industrial policy in the United States. I like to go back, for example, the land grant college system in the United States of the, that were established with the Morrill Acts in 1862 and later. It's even though it was an extraordinarily inventive system of encouraging productivity upgrade in agriculture by provision of land to the states that would then use to set up farms and businesses, and the transfer of technology, the use of agricultural extension, investment in training. And it was extremely important. And it's also relevant to my story in a different way, too, because one of the themes that I want you to take from my talk is that really when we think about industrial policy, let's not focus too much on exclusively, at least, on manufacturing, and that both in agriculture and services, there are similar opportunities for productive upgrading that, in fact, if anything, probably are becoming more important over time for reasons that I'll get back to. And even in more recent times, if you think about, Reagan, of course, said the state was the problem, or the government was the problem rather than the solution. But of course, he was the one who engaged in protection against the Japanese imports on steels and cars and with the VERs. Pinochet, we think about sort of the apostle of neoliberal market-friendly policies. He engaged in extensive subsidization of forestry in Chile. Margaret Thatcher went to Japan begging for investment and seeing how she could attract foreign investment from Japanese companies into Britain. So I think what's really different is less that there is a lot of industrial policy going on today, and more that it's being done self-consciously. So that the difference now is you have policymakers sort of shouting out from the rooftops that that's really what they're engaged in, and it's okay, that's a good thing. And I think that gives us an opportunity to sort of engage in thinking and reflecting about sort of how this thing should be done, how it should work. And I think this is why I think it's important and exciting. Now, we've been talking about industrial policy. I haven't heard anybody actually define what we mean by industrial policy. And I will define what I mean by industrial policy. And I think I should say that for reasons that I've already stated, that it's not really necessarily about manufacturing. Sometimes I prefer to use the term, which I think the Inter-American Development Bank first used, which is productive development policies, which I think is better. But what I mean by whether I say industrial policy or productive development policy, I'm referring to government policies that explicitly target the transformation of the structure or productivity of economic activity in pursuit of some public goal. And of course, what's almost always implicit in this is that there's a kind of a choice in where the priorities are going to be placed, that we're going to be engaging or supporting certain types of activities, and implicitly, never explicitly stated, not others. And that's probably why the controversy is governments making choices of these kinds. So I think from that perspective, what's not industrial policy, obviously policies that are explicitly horizontal, both in terms of their impact, in terms of their intention, as well as their impact, policies that do not have any obvious effect on the structure of economic activity, such as broad macroeconomic policies, broad social policy, obviously would not fall. But I would also exclude policies that might have ultimately some effect on the structure of economic activity, but are not explicitly targeting structural change. So, an across-the-board R&D subsidy, for example, would not necessarily consider that an industrial policy, even though, of course, it would have effects through increasing the supply of innovation and so forth. Similarly, with just subsidizing education in STEM and so forth. So that would be just to be upfront about what I mean by that. It has to do something about trying to alter the structure of economic activity, the structure and also the productive structure of economic activity. Now, I'm going to take as my role the broad caricature of industrial policy that I think until recently was being held, that the economists thought of industrial policy in particular ways. And this is going to already feel a little bit anachronistic, because so much of what we've been talking about today really shows already that we're going beyond this traditional understanding of industrial policy that economists have had. So one is, in terms of objective, I think typically the predominant focus has been on internalizing learning or innovation spillovers that people usually think, whether it comes in the form of infant industry promotion, or it's in the promoting technology-intense sectors and so forth. The emphasis has tended to be on innovation and on learning spillovers. And therefore, the remedy that people have talked about is really just focusing on subsidies. So it's almost like industrial policy is almost always in people's mind, synonymous with subsidization or incentives of a financial kind. It could be tax incentives and so forth. And that the sectoral focus of industrial policies is almost exclusively, again, in association-wise, in terms of is on manufacturing and high-tech sectors in particular. And of course, then there is the usual discussion in economics, which is largely a lot of hand-waving, which is that the risks of there are two major risks in the conduct of industrial policy. Viewed in this way. One is an informational issue, the other is a political issue. The informational issue is that governments cannot identify where these learning spillovers exist too well, so they cannot pick winners in that way, and that's one major category of risk. The other category of risk is actually that even in principle, governments had the ability to identify where these externalities or spillovers are, that they would be subject to political pressure and lobbying, and they would be acting in behest of large or powerful firms rather than necessarily addressing this particular market failure. Solyndra, of course, is an example, and I'll return to Solyndra in a couple of seconds as sort of, a recent example of how industrial policy can go wrong, apparently for that reason. And with that sort of, with these risks in mind, then I think the kind of informal literature in economics and political economy about what kind of prerequisites need to be present for countries to be able to engage industrial policy successfully is that governments need to have good information, and then in order to be able to avoid capture from firms, that they need to keep firms at arm's length, and that they need to be able to enforce relatively strict conditionality and discipline on their firms. And the East Asian example has been used typically about how sort of a kind of capacity that other governments do not have. That supposedly East Asian governments had this capacity to discipline their firms, whereas other countries do not. And this, of course, has come up in our discussion of Philip's paper earlier. Okay, and then in terms of the evidence, until very recently, of course, most economists said that, well, the evidence we have shows that industrial policy rarely works. And up until relatively recently, really like 6 to 8 years ago, I think almost all the empirical evidence that existed in respectable journals showed that industrial policy in this sense did not work. Even in cases like Japan and Korea, which sort of informal anecdotal evidence would suggest that industrial policy actually appeared to have worked better than in other countries where it was much more obviously, supposedly, a failure. Now, this last one obviously is clearly out of date. We've already heard so many papers that sort of suggest that that industrial policy, at the very least, we can find lots of instances of industrial policy that it is at least effective. Of course, now we're seeing papers that we've seen also today that are doing much more explicit social cost-benefit analysis. But if you apply simply the standard of effectiveness, which is did industrial policy really produce the structural change in the direction that was desired? So let's say kind of a sort of lower threshold for sort of the desirability of industrial policy. But even there, I think the evidence seemed to show the opposite until recently. So. And so the literature actually today is, I'll mention a few other papers as I go on, but has changed so much, the empirical literature on industrial policy in terms of showing sort of this wide evidence, sort of range of evidence from a number of different places about its effectiveness, that I almost now worry that sort of the selection effect that probably earlier operated in terms of keeping out papers that potentially showed a positive effect being screened out of journals. Now we might be having the opposite, that it might be difficult to publish a paper that shows negative effects. But there is, it's remarkable. But so I don't need to say much more about how the evidence actually sort of should move our priors much more in the direction of effectiveness in a lot of different contexts. But I want to focus much more on sort of the rest of this slide and argue that this caricature, admittedly, is now changing with a different understanding and different set of circumstances. And just to summarize my talk, what I'm going to say in terms of this list is, first, I will want to expand the objectives. I think there is a broader range. I'll provide an alternative characterization of the set of objectives that are much broader. In terms of policy instruments and remedies, I'm going to suggest that, in fact, they go way beyond subsidies. And I think this has been a bit of a blind spot for economists because subsidies are easy to capture and measure, well, much easier than many of the other types of interventions that I'll talk about, but that a lot of effective industrial policy is really other things besides subsidies. Third, I'll mention in terms of our focus on manufacturing, national champions, high-tech sectors, and so forth. I think, again, we need to pay much greater attention to services. This is an issue that came up earlier, so I think it's sort of that's one reason that I prefer the term productive development policy to industrial policy. That I think that's another blind spot in the conduct of industrial policy today, whether it's in the United States or it's in Europe or India for that matter. I think an excessive focus on manufacturing and not looking for important opportunities in services, and I'll highlight the importance of that. And then in terms of prerequisites and how do you do the governance of industrial policy, I'm going to suggest that what's on here is a very bad model of what actually governments do when they're successful. Instead of we know that a lot of successful industrial policy is carried out in the context of very inadequate, very poor information, instead of governments maintaining arm's length relationships with firms. It actually entails significant iterative collaboration with firms on a back and forth, partly, in fact, to acquire information about where problems are and how to solve them and whether policies are working. And instead of very strict, hard conditionality, a la sort of a caricature of East Asia, the East Asian hard state, in fact, most effective industrial policies has really much more of a soft kind of conditionality, some targets, some expected behavioral outcomes, but often sort of revised iteratively as long as firms showing sort of good faith efforts. So that's really, in some sense, the summary of my talk. In terms of a broader conception of industrial policy. But let me sort of immediately jump into what I think, to me, is really the most important and significant success of industrial policy of the last 15 years. And this is what industrial policy in China has achieved in terms of the completely unexpected collapse in the price of renewables, solar and wind in particular, and then subsequently EVs and batteries and so forth. Nobody really expected this decline to be so rapid, now to the point where today, essentially for newly installed capacity for power generation, solar and wind are cheaper than fossil fuels. This is also the most significant gain we have achieved on the climate transition front. Anything that might have been achieved on carbon pricing and so forth, I think is really, to date, is outweighed by the impact of this. And it's interesting because early on, China was not a leader in this industry. The United States and Germany and other countries in the US started out with much better technologies. And even in terms of industrial policy, it was more, Germany and Spain and the US, for example, they were the leaders in terms of subsidizing renewables, but they sort of gradually moved out for a variety of different reasons, just as China went into this in a very, very big way. And so what we have is what I've said here, sort of heavy subsidies, but it really was, as I'm going to say in a second, is a really much broader range of instruments. But what we can measure and observe are the subsidies that have led to an increase in capacity, that have produced sort of learning by doing and traveling down learning costs, producing reductions in cost and then price and then expansion of market and then capacity expansion, and sort of this kind of virtuous cycle that has not just benefited China, it's benefited the world as a whole through this decline in the price of renewables. So that's a fantastic sort of gift that Chinese industrial policies have given the world in terms of this green transition. Now, China's green industrial policies, as I've suggested, have been much richer than subsidies. You can't just understand how China achieved this simply by looking at subsidies. That really would be missing a lot of it. So there was, of course, other kinds of financial incentives like directed credit and so forth, but there was public investment in R&D infrastructure. There was government procurement policies. There were demonstration programs set up in different parts of the country. There was extensive use of public venture capital, the use of regulatory changes, and a kind of very explicit self-conscious experimentation that there would be plans set up from the top. Municipalities would go on, there would be sort of, report back, you would learn what was going on. And there was a process of learning and iteration and revision that was the product of an ongoing relationship between national level policies and then everything that was happening subnationally, in particular sort of the provinces and the municipalities running their own programs. And this collaborative approach between on the one hand, the central government and the local governments, and on the other hand, between these governments at various levels and business and the investors and the private sector, was really it was a very different model of doing industrial policy than you would think if you just look, for example, at the way that economists would analyze this is by just looking at sort of measuring the subsidies and figuring out whether there were any sort of spillovers. Now, you find, as this recent paper does, that you had significant within municipality spillovers in the subsidies from solar panels, but it was really more than just subsidies. It was a lot others, and it's an issue I'll come back to towards the end of my talk. There's also something interesting here about the political economy of green industrial policies, because you might sort of want to say, why would a country produce, do something that will produce such positive spillovers to the rest of the world? What has what has blocked action on the climate front was precisely that everybody wants to be a free rider. So I think what's different with green industrial policies, and the reason that we've been able to make some progress there, whereas progress on carbon pricing has been significantly more limited, is that it's basically these programs you can combine the climate, the green transition objective, with a variety of others where the benefits are much more directly national. So obviously the Chinese government viewed these industrial policies not just from the standpoint of climate and the green transition, but also as essentially getting a head start in what they considered would be the industries of the future. So therefore, there were significant national commercial competitiveness gains that was attached for that. And of course, the other reason that green industrial policies are useful from a political economy standpoint in this context is that unlike carbon pricing or carbon taxation, which is a tax, hurts people, green industrial policies are a subsidy. They actually, provide benefits. And I think this has been an important difference as to why on this very important front, the green transition, green industrial policies have been so much more promising that they essentially are carrots instead of sticks. They produce winners, immediate gainers. And therefore, through creating winners early on, they are able to potentially in the future affect the underlying political economy by creating more support for policies that would directly focus on decarbonization and raise the price of carbon. We've seen this in China, where there has been a slight refocus on directly on decarbonization in recent years. We're seeing that also in subtle ways, I think, in the United States, where the EPA is now able to pass regulations on utilities and their use of need to phase out coal-fired power plants in ways that would have been politically impossible 2 years ago, because the IRA now provides huge subsidies for carbon capture. So with these huge subsidies on carbon capture, it becomes easier for utilities to actually, or at least politically more difficult for them to resist phasing out or at least doing carbon capture on these power plants. So, and we see it elsewhere too. If you look at, for example, the relative weight of lobbying on energy policy, for fossil fuel companies versus renewable companies. Like you go back something like 10 years ago, the lobbying spent, the lobbying dollars spent by renewable companies was tiny compared to fossil fuel companies. Now today they've reached about something like half. It's not all the way there, but it's becoming a kind of a countervailing lobby, allowing a broader range of policies to be pursued. So, I'm making this point both because I think the green transition is important in and of itself, but also because in the context of our current conversation on industrial policy, it's a very good example of how industrial policies can also serve a kind of a second best role in a context where first best instruments elsewhere, such as carbon pricing, may not be available. So I think going back then to the sort of set of objectives that industrial policy should pursue, I would add to the technological and other externalities, sort of three other objectives. So one has to do with coordination failures. That is, government has a role to sort of bring, ensure that complementary investments, whether it's sort of, on the demand side or where there's input-output linkages and so forth, in the presence of scale effects and so forth, could be important. Government has a role in terms of providing missing public inputs. Now, this is important because when we think about public inputs, we usually think about infrastructure and things like that. We think as horizontal policies. But of course, many of these things like infrastructure or education, you need to target it to specific economic activities or to specific locations. So this need to actually choose makes these inputs often akin to providing incentives, because you're providing essentially very specialized workforce skills, or you're investing in a particular type of infrastructure, or you're engaging in changing sector-specific legal or administrative frameworks. And then finally, of course, these second best factors that come into play, as in the green industrial policies that I've just talked about. And therefore, when you think about sort of what is the optimal policy, when you have all these sort of broader kinds of market failures that industrial policy is targeting, then it really is much more than subsidies. It's much richer, and each one of these will call for a somewhat different type of instrument, right? A coordination failure you don't want to address through subsidies, or sort of a shortage of workforce training in a particular skill category you don't necessarily want to address by subsidizing or providing tax incentive to firms. But also, of course, as we've discussed, I think these first best policies also have to be tempered by political administrative considerations that are highly context specific. So in that context, sort of having sketched such a encouraging picture of green industrial policies in China and how they were tremendous and so forth, and granted, even there, of course, presumably there were lots of individual failures. But what about the failures? What do sort of these big failures like Solyndra teach us? As I'm sure many of you will remember, Solyndra was a big political embarrassment for the Obama administration. It was sort of the landmark. It was supposed to be the Obama administration sort of landmark, green transition policy, sort of these loan guarantees to firms engaged in green industries. And Solyndra happened to be the first beneficiary of this loan guarantee program that the Obama administration provided, and then 2 years subsequently failed miserably, and sort of the company executives were dragged in front of Congress. There was a big investigation, and Obama had to sort of walk back his support for this. Now, what do we learn for this? I think so this kind of experience is typically used to then argue that, look, obviously governments cannot pick winners. Here's a wonderful example of that. But I think people often forget that Solyndra was part of a range of very similar loan guarantees that were issued to many other many other companies as well. Around the same time, only about a year after Solyndra, I think, is, Tesla benefited from a similar loan guarantee from the Department of Energy at a very critical time for the company, and of course, it just became the behemoth that it is now. So I think obviously, sort of these programs have to be evaluated as portfolios. You have to look at sort of what you're doing around, across the board, and not just pick on individual winners or losers. So Solyndra really was a failure only to the extent that the loan guarantee should have been avoided with what was known ex ante, and maybe it should have been, but that it was allowed to persist for too long. And I think the political failure here, I think, was that instead of selling this program as a portfolio, the government basically, instead of going to the American public and saying, look, we know that these are all, a lot of them these are startups, these are new technologies, we're trying they'll try all kinds of different things, not all of them will be successful. Obama actually went and to Solyndra and made a big speech, touting this company as sort of in the vanguard of sort of this program. And of course, that's precisely the wrong way of presenting this program and focusing only on one of the programs. Okay, so I'm just going to skip a couple because, as I said, we're all on the same page. I don't need to do more preaching on that front. But let me move to now a very different domain of industrial policy, because that points us to some of the other new elements that I think we need to incorporate. And this is sort of another variant of industrial policy, which are called place-based policies, because they're largely sort of focusing on regions which may be left behind or sort of have suffered. We've seen examples of that here in the presentation on the south of Italy. It turns out, of course, there have been a number of studies on in the southern part of Italy, and of course a very nice paper on the UK, which have used a variety of identification, diff and diff, synthetic control, or IV, and so forth, to identify the causal effect of subsidies on local employment, local investment, and local economic growth. And the surprising thing in this literature is that if you were to sort of ask people, which two European countries do you think where industrial policies have been a failure? And of course, it wouldn't be long before people would mention the UK and Italian policies with respect to the South. And yet we're learning that these policies were actually quite effective in certain domains. But the other part, again, I think these studies are focusing on subsidies. The other interesting work that has been done on these local economic development policies and place-based policies really don't focus necessarily on subsidies and tax incentives per se, but focus on the sort of local economic development or coalitions or cross-sectoral coalitions that really focus on generating what I've called earlier sort of customized public inputs to promote economic activity and productive upgrading. Some of the best work on this has been done by Tim Bartik in the US context. And I noticed that I've left the reference to his work out, but it's Tim Bartik. This chart is taken from Tim Bartik. And Tim Bartik has shown a couple of important things that I think has broad international relevance. One is that that a lot of success really depends on being able to provide these customized business services or inputs. Bartik focuses mostly on manufacturing, so what he's talking about is sort of manufacturing extension services, customized workforce training, the provision of technology or the provision of green fields, And secondly, he argues that, in fact, compared to these services, whether it's the provision of particular infrastructure or workforce training or manufacturing extension, that actually subsidies are much less cost-effective, that you have to pay much more in subsidy to generate one kind of one job. Now, having mentioned jobs, and in fact, a lot of these, place-based policies primarily focus on jobs because it's the disappearance of good jobs or the scarcity of good jobs in these regions that often is the motive for these place-based policies. I think we need to sort of maybe step back, think also a little bit about sort of how does an industrial policy actually work to promote good jobs. Now, I think this is an important objective in and of itself because of, again, the recent literature in economics and other fields that has shown that the sort of deteriorating local labor market conditions and what I call sort of the disappearance or the scarcity of good jobs, whether it's because of trade shocks or because it's automation or in Europe austerity shocks, these disturbances have been linked to a variety of social and political ills, that when people lose jobs, it's not just a personal income downfall, it's a loss of social recognition, it's a loss of meaning, and then we have a variety of social and political consequences. And you can think about this as essentially as pointing to a different type of externality, which is that good jobs provide local, if you will, good job externalities, that is sort of, in terms of providing social and political environments that promote a middle class and broader democratic values. Now, I think the role that industrial policy can play is essentially to think about how good jobs can be created as a complement to labor, sort of supply side interventions in labor markets. That when we think about sort of good jobs going missing, our immediate, as economists, our response is to let's invest in training, let's invest in education. But I think good jobs have a sort of good jobs focused industrial policies have a complementary a role to play. And these policies are actually focusing on sort of, increasing demand for the type of workers that exist in certain local labor markets. They focus on providing these services and productivity increasing interventions with respect to firms, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises. And what I think is especially important for the use of industrial policy towards this end of expanding good jobs, that it cannot be focused on manufacturing. This is, that sort of manufacturing is a smaller and smaller part of the labor absorptive capacity of the economy, even though, as we've heard, the Biden administration has spent, tens, if not, sort of hundreds of billions of dollars through the IRA on subsidies and various types of manufacturing, and manufacturing construction investment has increased significantly. The share of employment, manufacturing employment and total employment has steadily declined. So it's like an almost inevitable fact that the vast majority of future jobs in the US economy, in fact, elsewhere as well, is going to be created in services. So you have if you want to create good jobs, more productive jobs, you will have to act on the productivity margin in services and labor absorbing services. And I don't think there's any possibility of reversing this decline in manufacturing employment. So if we look at competitors of the United States that have been significantly more successful at competing in world markets in manufacturing. So let's look at South Korea, for example. The share of real value added in GDP has actually gone up significantly and then has managed to remain constant, so there's no decline, but the share of employment has plummeted. And so this disconnect is even in China, China in the last 10, 15 years has lost as many manufacturing workers as all manufacturing workers that exist in the United States and Germany combined. And you wouldn't see it in their exports of manufacturing statistics or industrial output statistics. So there's no way that if you are targeting good jobs and thinking of industrial policy in the context of job creation, that you can do it with a manufactured-oriented subsidy. Manufacturer-oriented industrial policy. I would add another important dimension here in terms of what's important, and this is going back to some of the issues that we discussed with Alondra Nelson in the very first session about sort of the endogeneity of the direction of technological change that I think that we need to also consider how we can invest in technologies that are labor-friendly, just like green technologies is a priority for investment, or the DoD invests in defense-related technologies. We can think about how we can invest in technologies that essentially, either by increasing the tasks that the lower-skilled workers can do, or directly increasing the productivity, allowing them to do the jobs of more skilled workers than them, that these sort of explicit labor-friendly investments in labor-friendly technologies, I think, should be a priority for the future. And there are examples of this in a variety of labor-absorbing services, whether it's long-term care, it's retail, or in education, that by providing appropriate technologies to less educated workers, you can actually enable them to be more productive. And since these are the labor-absorbing sectors of the economy, this is going to be, I think, an important direction for industrial policies broadly. Again, productive development policies. So here I would suggest that maybe you will remember Alondra talked about ARPA-H, which is sort of this new agency modeled after DARPA, which is really focusing on health and biomedical sciences and so forth. I think we really need an ARPA-W as well, which is sort of an agency that's focusing on frontier technologies that are explicitly designed to be more worker-friendly. All right. I think there's a version of this for developing countries as well, which I'm not going to go into because I've run out of time. But the version of this is that developing countries are going through their own process of sort of premature deindustrialization. The jobs there, again, also will be in labor-absorbing services. So we have a variety of experiments that need to be scaled up and multiplied about how we can engage in small and medium-sized enterprises, predominantly in services, to increase productivity of workers there. All right, so let me just finish by going back to my slide, which is how sort of this caricature of industrial policy is changing. And I'm going to leave this here because essentially a summary of some of the points that I've tried to make relative to this, compared to the caricature of industrial policy that many of us carry in our minds. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dani. So we do have some time for questions. Dani has to run to the airport after what he's done, but we do have at least, we can take at least 10 minutes, I guess, to discuss. So maybe I'll choose. Oh my goodness. Okay. Let's start here. And okay, Felipe, Joe, Niels. Okay, I'm sorry for this. Then I'll have to switch back. But yeah, Felipe, go first. Oh, and Kate. Yeah.
Thanks for the great keynote. I have a question. Right in the beginning, you were defining what is industrial policy. I think this is an important. Okay. And that's for academics thinking about the space is something that's important to have clear in mind, the definition. And in my mind, that's not totally fleshed out. As you said, what is not industrial policy? And you mentioned subsidies, R&D subsidies in general, should not be classified as industrial policies. And then in the next slide, you have Pigouvian subsidies, which is a sort of tax incentives. And we had earlier Josh mentioning that in the US, most of industrial policy is done through the IRS, which is sort of taxes. And Joe and others have worked on showing the importance of taxes affecting real economic choices. So later in the talk, you mentioned the
Can I clarify that just very quickly?
Yes.
Because I think it might be helpful. So I think of, an across-the-board R&D subsidy, right, that does not specify where the R&D is made. I think that's, in my sense, that would not be industrial policy, it would be horizontal. But the IRA says you get the, tax subsidy only if you're investing in renewables or green industries and so forth. Or, so subsidies for labor, friendly technology. So it's not when you're specifying the direction of technological change, I think then you're making these choices, and I think that would fall under my definition of industrial policy. But I think most countries have, baseline R&D kind of a tax incentive that is generally neutral.
Dani, should we take several, or do you want to go one by one? Yes.
I'll pick.
As they come, I see. Okay. All right. So Kate, let's go Kate next. Try and get some gender balance in our
Thank you very much. Kate McNamara, Georgetown University. Thank you so much for this incredible tour de force of where we are right now. Just one quick note. When I think about industrial policy as a political scientist, the thing that really strikes me is the political visibility of it, right? So which gets to your sort of, making sort of general policies that affect everyone in the same way versus this sort of very political, visible choice about the common interests and values that are going to be pursued through whatever the market structure efforts are. But anyhow, I'm not going to tell you what industrial policy is. My question is about, you teach at the Kennedy School, I teach in the School of Foreign Service, we have many people here who are engaged in educational activities. How do we think about educating the next generations going forward? What are the sort of ways we might think about sort of the role of public policy education, given the standard was so much a much more orthodox and narrow view of sort of how, let the economy work, laissez-faire, everything. Can you talk a bit about that? Give me some help on that.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I mean, I hate to don't get me started on that. I mean, I think, people hate me, but they'll hate you even more for keeping them away from dinner. Let me just answer your first question instead, and we can have that conversation separately. I think that's right, but often, as in the case of, as in my example of Solyndra and President Obama, that's sometimes the fault of the politicians themselves. It was President Obama who went there and planted the flag right on top of, Solyndra's plant. There are many other things that don't become politically salient. A great example in the U.S. is DARPA, right? Very few people, and it's being incredibly successful and just operates totally under sort of, the kind of, so it has not become politicized at all. So I think it's possible.
Yeah, when I think of industrial policy, I think about two other things. It's not just sectoral allocation, it's also the choice of technology and promoting technology consistent with your view of public investment. And when I think about developing countries, one of the things with the end of export-led, with manufacturing export-led growth, there's going to, if you're raising living standards, it's going to have to focus on agriculture, at least for large fractions of the population. So having industrial policies increasing productive capacities in agriculture seem to be an important instrument. The second thing is when I think of, at the other extreme, when I think of the healthcare and the care sector you mentioned, the issue here is not so much productivity, but the way the whole sector is organized. You have very productive nurses that are saving our lives that are not paid very well. So it's the exercise of market power, it's the regulatory, it's the rules that lead to people who are very productive but don't get paid. So I think part of industrial policy we ought to be thinking of more broadly as restructuring the entire economy. And part of that then also, in terms of your remedies, we know that capital markets don't work perfectly, and that was one of the reasons why credit availability was such an important tool in East Asia. And to go to the question about, our teaching, the Pigouvian remedy is only an optimal remedy if there's only one market failure, which is the one. We know that, and yet we have lots of people who continue to say it's optimal to have 3.5 degrees global warming because there's only one market failure, and that's because global warming.
Yeah, I'm totally with you on your third point. Just very briefly on the others, on the need for organizational change. So I think you're absolutely right on the example of nurses and many other cases. So I think you need both. You need both organizational changes, like you didn't get the whole nurse practitioner profession arise until there were regulatory changes and so forth, and people invested in those training programs. But it's also the case that there were new technologies that enabled nurses to do the kinds of things that previously only more trained physicians could do. And now, of course, with AI and these digital technologies, there are many tools that you can give to relatively less trained care workers that they can perform tasks that they're currently not allowed to perform. So I think it's a combination of both the new technologies and organizational changes that will allow them to do that. On agriculture, of course, I agree with you, but the reason I didn't emphasize perhaps agriculture so much is there are lots of opportunities in agriculture, but it's very difficult to see agriculture as a labor-absorbing sector. So in fact, the more successful you are with raising productivity, as has happened in Latin America with soy and many of your non-traditional exports, the more rapidly people will be leaving agriculture. It's very capital intensive. And so you're stuck with this issue that you and I have written about, which is that the workers will have to be, the jobs will be in services. And agriculture is good and use those things, but if you want to create a middle class, you want people to be moving to more productive jobs, that will have to be in services, so which is an entirely different challenge. Yeah.
Let's take three next again, just to get a little. I'm going to go all the other side of the room, Andrew, and then I'll come over here to.
Thank you. I'm broadly sympathetic, but I'm wondering the following. You make the case for industrial policy that's softer rather than disciplinary, with back and forth between the public and private sectors. But your leading example of a successful industrial policy is China's green transition, which rests upon what Human Rights Watch has called a green fist, where they have committed massive abuses of the human rights of coal producers and consumers, expropriated farmers and repressed their protests, forced labor, et cetera, all of which contributes to their bargaining leverage when they bargain with the renewable firms. And I'm wondering whether that is a soft industrial policy or a disciplinary industrial policy.
I have to take this now. No, I mean, look, I'm against, let me be clear, I'm against any industrial policy that just is, that necessitates or even creates as a byproduct human rights. I don't think this would be a right way to characterize how this cost declines in renewables in China has happened. But I understand where you're getting from, and I'm totally sympathetic to sort of these human rights concerns about China. But I don't think they're sort of necessarily have to coincide. Yeah. Sorry, I don't want to take.
Okay, Juan Carlos. Can we give him a microphone? Can someone give him a microphone? Here.
Raise your hand.
Here.
Oh.
Hi. I have a question similar to Joe's, which is you defined industrial policy in terms of structural change. And my question is the extent to which structural change is defined in terms of vertical sectors, or you allow also for a horizontal definition of structure where you mostly upgrade quality or other forms of productivity upgrading within sectors.
And then is it Andrew over there? Yeah, here in the back. And I'm sorry that I know there's lots of hands. I'm not going to be able to get to everyone, so I'm sorry for being.
Hi. So you really eloquently explained to us what it is, industrial policy, why we need it, and where it needs to go. But I have a more basic question. Why now? Why are we doing this now? You said it has always been around, but it has certainly been ramped up in the last 3 to 5 years around the globe, right? And I don't see anything new in the ideas. Like, people have supported green industrial policies since 2000. South Korea has been doing it since 2007, 2008. Why do we see this push for industrial policy now? What's the story that drives this moment?
Thank you for a great talk. A question about the impact of information market failures on the conduct of effective industrial policy and what to do about it. So 3 quick examples. One is the U.S. has a terrible, inconsistent system of measuring the number of jobs by industry. So BLS says there's 200,000 people making chips in America, and the Census Bureau says there's 100,000. It's a difference of two. And over 2,000 firms versus 790 firms. That's issue one. Issue two is if you're a 17-year-old at home and you're graduating high school, you got to make a decision about what you're going to do next. Most of us went to a 4-year school, but a lot of people now are thinking about non-degree credentials, and they have no clue how to make a decision at 17 that has irreversible consequences when you're 25. So all these efforts need people with skilled technical abilities. And so how do you address that aspect of labor market information failure? And then the last is that in workforce development, there are now 70 federal programs that train people to be part of the skilled technical workforce. And they're not coordinating. Every agency now gets its own workforce program. Federal Communications Commission, Department of Energy, Department of Transportation. And so there's a network failure. Because these people are all trying to learn from, none of them have any experience in this, and they're not learning from each other.
Yeah, I mean, going backwards, I think on workforce development, I think the failing until now is more one of underinvestment rather than sort of necessarily duplication of programs. Maybe we will get there, but I think as first order of priority would be to increase the budgets of community colleges and expand the budgets of sectoral workforce training programs, which we know work but have not been scaled up. But I'm not a great expert on this. On why now, I'd like to claim that now because Joe Stiglitz's papers are now being read, but unfortunately I think the reality is different. I think the answer is geopolitics. That I think that's what has made the new, and I think it's probably 75% geopolitics and 25% climate. I mean, I think climate also has become a bigger issue. I think that's sort of, I would say those are the two things, as much as we economists may want to take credit. On sort of how do I define sectors, I think it depends on the application. So I think about an I, index that you attach to different activities, and how you define that I is going to depend on sort of what is the margin over which, where is a relevant distinction to be made. Sometimes it's sectors, but more often it's just going to be one type of training as opposed to another, one type of technology as opposed to another. So think about activity I, where, that I could refer to any one of those things.
Actually out of time. So we promised Dani that we wouldn't run over. So unfortunately, we're going to have to close here. And apologies to all the people who had their hands up who didn't get a chance to ask a question. Let's a round of applause for Dani Rodrik.